The opposition Congress party today called for an India shutdown. This is playing politically as well. Some other opposition parties also supported the call. There were reports of vandalism from some parts, which is condemnable. Protests should be peaceful, but the government can also not continue to ignore the plight of Indians. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has appreciated people who voluntarily gave up subsidies on gas cylinders. He has appreciated Indians who are tax compliant. It is the government that reciprocates the goodwill and tries to stem the skyrocketing fuel prices. Joining us for more on this is Daniel Lacalle, a Spanish economist joining us from London. Daniel, first up, I want to ask you for your initial remarks on the way the rupee has been sliding and what you make of what the government has done so far.
Well, the rupee has been falling basically because there's a combination of falling reserves and at the same time increasing expenses coming from higher imports for the economy. You know, the economy has been rising on a high trade deficit and a high fiscal deficit, and therefore what has happened is that the imbalances seen in some of the accounts are generating an outflow of dollars, and therefore the rupee falls. No, what I think that the government is looking is basically at reducing the pressure on the rupee and doing it, from my perspective, in a very mild way, because at the end of the day, the issue remains on that combination of fiscal and trade deficit that can reduce reserves while the requirements for external financing grow. So as the dollar goes up and also commodities go up, the Indian economy requires more, let's say, external financing, and it puts pressure on the rupee. I think that the government would need to take some fiscal and monetary measures a little bit more aggressive than the ones that have been taken so far in order to, let's say, stop and restabilize the rupee.
All right, in terms of the reaction that has come in from across the country, Daniel, a lot has been said about how global crude oil prices is something that is not under the government's control. But elaborate for our viewers what the government can do in such a scenario.
Well, obviously, yes, commodity prices are international, but what the government can definitely do is to increase interest rates, reduce money supply, reduce some of the public spending in order to, let's say, reduce at least the fiscal deficit, and put measures that attract more investment into the economy so that the inflow of dollars is higher. I think that the government in the last 3 years has been looking fundamentally at increasing the fiscal deficit, has not worried about the trade deficit, and what it needs to do is to provide fiscal incentives, tax incentives, in order to attract more investments, more dollar investments, more foreign exchange investments, and at the same time reduce the outflow of rupees in terms of fiscal deficit. So be more, let's say, be a little bit less aggressive on spending.
All right, we're going to leave it there for the moment. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the broadcast. Daniel joining us from London, but joining us also is our correspondent from Bengaluru, Nishchita Virendra, who's standing by. Nishchita, help our viewers understand what the effect of that protest has been in Bengaluru city.
That's right, Molly. In fact, in Karnataka, probably it's just one of the very few states in India where the entire Bharat Bandh that had been called by the Congress has been successful, understandably so, because it is a Congress-JDS coalition government here. So transportation services were particularly hit, which had a cascading effect on people going to work. Schools and colleges were shut. Even offices that chose to remain open had to shut for the later half of the day because there was absolutely no transportation services for the employees ways to get to their workplace. Even the state-run BMTC as well as the KSRTC buses chose to stay off-road. A few of them that attempted to ply in the early hours of the day had to face the wrath of the protesters. In Bengaluru, which is a coastal town, one of the buses was stone-pelted. In Bengaluru, we can call it a massive show of strength of sorts for the Congress. There was a huge rally that was organized right in the center of the city. You had different groups, not just the JDS as well as the Congress, but you had student groups, you had several smaller communist parties, several other pro-Kannada organizations, taxi drivers unions, auto drivers unions, all partaking in this agitation. And they demanded that the government reduce the fuel prices, reduce the taxes on the fuel, as it is the common man who is bearing the brunt at the end of the day. The entire Bandh was supposed to end at around 3 p.m. but even now normalcy has not returned to Bengaluru. Most of the commercial establishments continue to remain shut, and even vehicles have reduced in number greatly. A city that would have been otherwise been facing chock-a-block traffic at this time on a Monday evening has absolutely free-flowing traffic. So there seems to be one silver lining to the Bharat Bandh.
Sweden's two main political blocs, the Social Democrats and the Moderates, are now neck and neck after Sunday's parliamentary election. Coming in at the third place, the anti-immigration Sweden Democrats Party has made gains more than before. It won about 18% of the vote, up from 12.9% in the last elections. A heated battle to form a working coalition now looks like a certainty. Like many European countries affected by an influx of Syrian migrants and refugees, immigration policy had become central to Sweden's election. And after more than a half-century of soft centre-left policies, in Sweden, voters are warming up to an anti-immigration stance. So that brings us to the question of why this is happening. At the height of the immigration influx into Europe in 2014 and 2015, Sweden accepted almost 250,000 asylum seekers, by far the highest rate per capita in the European Union. But since then, the rate of violent crime has soared in areas with a high immigrant population. Besides the high incidence of gang violence and drug trafficking, residents complain that these areas are being virtually colonized by immigrants whose cultures clash with Swedish values. Many Swedes and older immigrants alike have begun to say that Sweden does not feel like Sweden anymore. Some critics of the government's liberal immigration policies complain that the police are afraid to intervene for fear of being accused of racial profiling. This is probably why Sweden Democrats has an increased vote share in this year's election. And there are voices claiming that Sweden Democrats have their roots in the neo-Nazi movement, and hence other parties should come together to keep Sweden Democrats out. The Sweden Democrats wanted to hold talks with the leader of the centre-right moderate party about forming the next government. But the party said a coalition is out of question.
Jag är ju bekymrad eftersom SD växer. Jag är väl inte heller en stor fan av Kristdemokraterna. Jag hade nog hellre sett att Socialdemokraterna fick fler.
Väldigt svårt att säga eftersom man hävdar så bestämda uppfattningar hela tiden och har tagit ställning. Så här kan jag inte säga riktigt vad som kommer hända. Det jag tycker mig se ändå, det är att på längre sikt så är jag hoppfull för de yngre väljarna. Och de som kommer, de har lite andra värderingar.
Oli Barat is joining us for more on this. Oli, there have been so many reports indicating that Sweden does not feel like Sweden anymore. In a way, immigration has become one of the focal points around which this election has revolved.
Yeah, I think we should reject that premise at the start. Swedes will tell you that Sweden does still feel like Sweden, and many Swedes will also tell you that the international media has been slightly over-egging the situation within the country and the context in which this election has been held. Clearly, though, there are a lot of concerns from voters around the issue of immigration and issues related to immigration. Sweden has seen a huge influx of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees as part of the European migrant crisis, and certainly that has affected the way that people have voted. We have seen rising crime in some areas of Sweden, although official statistics linking that rise in crime to that influx of migrants is actually pretty hard to prove. The correlation is not as clear as some of the right-wing politicians in Sweden would certainly have you believe. It's also interesting to look at the numbers coming out of this Swedish election. Yes, the SD, the right-wing party, did come back with around 18% of the vote, and yes, that is up from 12 or 13% last time around, but it's actually significantly lower than many polls had been expecting. It's also significantly lower than the SD party itself had been expecting. We have seen a very strong vote comparatively compared to the SD for those centre-left and centre-right parties in Sweden. In fact, 80% of the vote in total has gone to those centrist parties. So in a way, this is being seen by some in Sweden as actually a rejection of the far right rather than a story about the rise of the far right. There are various different ways to view what has happened in Sweden. It's certainly true that both of the main centrist parties in Sweden have been talking more about immigration on the campaign trail, have been promising to get tougher in terms of Sweden's borders, have been promising to cut down on the numbers of people coming into the country and so quickly as we've seen over recent years. So clearly the SD, the right-wing party, the far-right party, has had a significant impact here, but that impact may actually have been to force those centrist parties to address some of these issues more head-on, and that appears to have appeased some voters who've stuck with those centrist parties instead of moving their vote to the far right.
The West Asian nation of Syria has been mired in a war for over 7 years now. What began as anti-government demonstrations soon snowballed into a full-fledged battle. Within no time, world powers were involved and even terrorists made inroads into the region. Following years of assault, the government forces have managed to recapture most of the armed opposition-held areas, but certain pockets still remain in the hands of miscreants. Idlib is one such province where a final assault is now underway to free the region from the hands of rebels. Meanwhile, government forces have managed to regain control of cities like Aleppo, encouraged by peace that has been prevailing in these cities. Those who had fled it are now coming back. WION's political editor, Kartikeya Sharma, is in Syria and filing exclusive reports that showcase the efforts to rebuild and revive the cities that have been lost to the war. Our West Asia Bureau Chief Daniele Pagani has been getting us the very latest from Amman. Daniele, what is the situation at the moment looking like in Idlib? What are your sources telling you?
The situation is looking like a very dangerous situation. Sources from the ground have said personally to me that this has been perhaps the hardest bombing they witnessed in the last 5 weeks. They talked about nearly 60 airborne attacks. Maybe not all of them are airborne. I mean, comprehension of what is an airborne attack on the ground from a civilian witness is not exactly precise. But this means that the offensive is slowly mounting, and both Russia and Syria are scaling up their attacks against a region where there seems to be no common understanding between the three major power players, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, in Idlib. This is what has been going on also this morning, in the early hours of the morning. The use of barrel bombs coming directly from Syrian choppers, military choppers, has been reported. Barrel bombs are largely condemned and violates largely conventions on the kind of weapons that can be used in war scenarios, but the Syrian government has been using barrel bombs throughout the war.
With government forces having won a majority of the rebel-held areas, the next challenge for the nation is to rebuild itself. Pockets across major towns in the country are limping back to normalcy. This cafe in Aleppo is one such example. Take a look at this exclusive report sent by WION's Kartikeya Sharma.
I'm in Aleppo and I'm in a cafe, and a very well-attended one. And the idea would be that in Aleppo, where will you find a cafe, a decent eating place? But Aleppo has rebuilt itself from the scratch. There are parts of the city which are completely destroyed, but there are parts of Aleppo which are as chic and bohemian as this. You know, a lot of young crowd has come, a lot of people have come. But the fact of the matter is that Aleppo in itself is rebuilding itself. And important thing is that Aleppo is a city which used to be an industrial center. So if you look at this place, if you look at this cafe, if you look at people who have come to this city center or the place which was under the control of what we call Islamic terrorists or fundamentalists, is a completely different place. So yes, this is a new face of Aleppo. This is a Aleppo which is trying to heal itself, build itself. People like food. For example, the Turkish coffee, it's very famous. Bitter, but there's nothing like Turkish coffee here. So Aleppo, through its cafes, evening life, food joints, garment stores, other utilitarian items, and its civil life, which was completely destroyed because of terrorism, has rebuilt itself. And this cafe tells you the story of how Aleppo is rebuilding itself. With camera person Manish Srivastav, Kartikeya Sharma for WION from Aleppo.